Thank you, Peter, and thanks all for coming on such a warm day, slightly cooler in here. The picture you see on the screen is the Great Synagogue that we all know and love. This is what you'll see when you come into the synagogue for a service or a wedding or some sort of public event. But as Peter alluded, it was not always thus. If we move to the next slide, you will see the synagogue as it was actually built. So let's just analyse this photograph for a few minutes. This photograph was taken sometime before 1906 for reasons we'll explore shortly. And it was taken sometime after the 1890s for reasons we can also explore. So this is a 1900 or so picture. Mostly the interior is the same. However, there are two major differences. Firstly, in the foreground you can see the bimah, the reading platform, and there it is in the more or less the center of the floor, although a little displaced towards the back, with the shulchan, with the actual desk for the Torah to be placed on, or the siddur to be placed on for the chazan, at the front of that bimah. And then if you look forward, you can see a flight of steps. In the middle of those, towards the top, is a pulpit, and behind that is the ark. And if you follow with your eye from the ark upwards, you can see that the choir loft, which we saw in the first picture, is not there. There are 4 windows which show natural light shining in from the outside. And that is in fact the synagogue as it was built in 1878. If we can recap very briefly about the Sydney Jewish community, Jews of course arrive on the First Fleet. There's a burial apparently in 1817. The Chevra Kadisha traces its existence back to 1817. There's public worship in the 1820s and 1830s. The synagogue on York Street, 1844. A breakaway synagogue in Macquarie Street in the 1850s, and then a reunification in the 1870s, which culminates in the building of the Great Synagogue and its opening in 1878. And this is how it was built. The Great Synagogue to unite all of Sydney Jewry, a bringing together of the disparate communities, and it's also a celebration and a statement about the wealth and the prestige and the importance and the settled nature of the Jews of Sydney. This is not a building built by outsiders or by a fearful or oppressed population. This is a self-confident and well-resourced community able to erect a substantial and highly decorated building. And this is what they put up. But what were the models? What was the basis for the synagogue as it was built? There had been very few synagogues in the Southern Hemisphere by that point, and there were certainly no Jewish architects of sufficient eminence or quality to be able to put up a synagogue of this sort. The genesis of the Great Synagogue, the building, only can be really understood if we look at its European model. So if I have the next slide. Now this, if anyone knows, is the original Central Synagogue in London. There is still a Central Synagogue in London on Great Portland Street. But the original building, which was put up in 1870 and designed by N.S. Joseph, was bombed during the war. It was destroyed in the Blitz, and this building's now gone, and a new building, which was paid for by Sir Isaac Wolfson after the war, is in its place. But this is the original 1870 try and get the picture back. This is the original 1870 Central Synagogue in Great Portland Street. And when the Sydney congregation appointed Thomas Rowe to be the architect of the Great Synagogue in the early 1870s, he got the contract in 1874. So because the congregation in Sydney employed a non-Jewish architect, they had to give him pretty tight guidelines on which to base his Sydney design. It was no point saying, okay, go away, design as a synagogue, because he wouldn't really know what to do. And he also couldn't wander around and see other synagogues because there were so few. If you commissioned an architect in Europe to build a synagogue, you could say, go and look at these different sites. But that wasn't possible in Sydney. So they said, base your design on the Central Synagogue in London, which was the most prestigious synagogue which had been built in recent times. Just to speak briefly about London, of course, there was the Great Synagogue, which was built in 1690, and then its final iteration in 1790. There was Great St. Helens new synagogue built in 1838, but the Central Synagogue was built in 1870 with Rothschild money, and that was the most contemporary and, as it were, up-to-date synagogue on which to base Rowe's design. And if we look at this picture, we will see quite remarkable similarities between the Old Central Synagogue and the Great Synagogue. I'll give you just a few examples. If you look at the arc end of the building, you see that Gothic arch reaching a point at the end, very similar to the Great Synagogue, and underneath you have an arch which ends with a series of scalloped features, also you'll find in the Great Synagogue. Here we have a row of slim columns topped by Corinthian capitals, obviously in two levels, the gallery and the main floor. A series of arches with plaster decoration, the seats all facing inwards, the central bimah with 4 posts at each corner and a lamp on top of each of the 4 posts, and then a box behind that for the choir. We'll come back to that in a second. I should say, mention a note about the seating. Now, as Commonwealth Jews, we're quite used to the seats facing inwards. But if you go to certain synagogues in Sydney, Mizrahi and Adash Yisrael being 2 good examples, they don't face inwards at all, they face towards the front. And in fact, that is a more classical European design, both for Orthodox synagogues and for non-Orthodox synagogues. This inward orientation for the seating is in fact a borrowing from the Spanish Portuguese Jews. The Sephardi synagogues from the Western Sephardi tradition tended to have inward-facing seats with the bimah placed towards the back. The Spanish Portuguese Jews were the first to come to England after Oliver Cromwell gave them the nod and the wink. They would be safe there. And when the Ashkenazim came a little while after, they adopted the arrangement of the Spanish Portuguese. And that's why most English synagogues and most English-style synagogues, whether the Great here or Central or other places, have inward-facing seats. It's a borrowing from the original Sephardim of London. The placing of the bimah is also a Sephardic tweak on a traditional design. If you go to a very traditional synagogue, let's say Mizrahi, you'll find 2 places where the service is led from. The Torah is read from a bimah in the middle, and the service is led from an amud, a lectern at the front. The Sephardim did away with that distinction, or with that dual positioning, and they moved the whole service to the middle. So if you look at this, picture of the Central Synagogue, there is no amud at the front. There is just the bimah in the middle, like in many synagogues that we know from our own experience, and the entire service was left there. But that is not an Ashkenazi practice originally. That's an import from Spanish Portuguese of London, which they themselves brought from places like Amsterdam and elsewhere. So Rowe is given this picture, or pictures like it. Maybe he corresponded with the architects or the synagogue in London and was sent plans, and this was the basis on which he prepared his design. And if we go to the next slide, we will see the original design of Thomas Rowe. So this is in the State Library of New South Wales on Macquarie Street. All of the original plans of the synagogue are preserved there, and this is what Rowe presented to the committee of the synagogue in 1874, and which they signed off on. This is what they agreed, this is what the contract was signed on. And therefore this is Rowe's original intention. Now, this synagogue was never built. The synagogue as he actually designed it was never put up, because financial constraints during the course of the construction meant that it had to be toned down in several ways. But this is at least his original intention, and it is quite remarkably similar to Central, although he has 1 or 2 little idiosyncratic touches. So let's look first at the bimah. There are 3 sections to this bimah, as you can see. There's a central section with a shulchan at the front, where the service was led from, and at the back there are 3 seats. Now they were the seats for the ministers. In London there was only one rabbi, the chief rabbi, and he was based at the Great Synagogue in Duke's Place. The other synagogues around London had ministers who were basically chazanim or preachers, but they were not fully qualified and, as it were, ordained rabbis. And so the traditional place for the rabbi at the front of the synagogue facing the congregation was not a feature of these mid to late 19th century London synagogues. They sat where they worked. The ministers sat on the bimah. And so you can see at the back of the middle section of the bimah 3 seats for the different members of the clergy. There's a little box at the front with 3 seats. That's for the wardens. In English terms, there was the president and the vice president and the treasurer. They were the 3 gentlemen who ran the place, or in some cases 2 wardens and a treasurer. For example, the warden of the Great Synagogue was always a Rothschild. He had that position from father to son or uncle to nephew for many years. And they sat in a box at the front. And then behind, there's another box. Now, this box could be for one of 2 things. Either it's for the shamash to wander around and give out honors and take people's names and so on, and to sit there when he wasn't otherwise occupied, or it may be a choir box. And that would make a lot of sense, because if the model was the Central Synagogue in London, then there was a choir box in the Central Synagogue, and this would be the same feature replicated in Sydney. Now, we have evidence that there was original intention to make the bimah out of marble, and this is a rather splendid, large, expansive edifice, and was not the one that was built because of financial constraints. But as an extra element of luxury are these 2 flights of stairs, one on either side, that one could ascend the bimah from either side of the congregation, and that actually in fact follows a religious requirement that you should ascend the bimah by the nearest route and leave it by the more distant route. So you should show alacrity as you go to the bimah, and you should show reluctance and should take a long time as you leave the bimah. So this is the original plan as submitted. If we could just raise the Titanic, if we could just raise the picture slightly. If we just look at the arc steps, we have straight steps. Now, straight steps are what was built, but Rowe's original plan for these rather gorgeous curved steps in front of the ark. The one really interesting innovation that Rowe seems to make is the horseshoe arrangement of the seating. I need to do more investigation, but it's very rare to find a synagogue before 1878 which has not straight seats and then maybe a series of seats at right angles at the back, but a beautiful curved horseshoe. I need to do more investigation, but if you look at contemporary and comparable synagogues, like New West End Synagogue in London, like Princess Road Synagogue in Liverpool, they don't have this horseshoe. This horseshoe may be Rowe's contribution to synagogue architecture, and we see that now, for example, at the Central Synagogue in Sydney, where there's also a horseshoe arrangement. So this is the plan which Rowe submitted and which was approved. And you do see certain rather elaborate touches. For example, if you look along the row of seats, each of the seat holders is a separate little semicircular reading desk. Not like the simple straight row we have now, but each one had their own individual and designated little lectern. That had to go because of financial considerations. Nevertheless, that's what he offered. He said, I can put this building up for you for between £10,000 and £13,000. Of course, even in its reduced form, it cost £23,000 to build, almost double Rowe's estimate. But anyone who's had building work done can probably sympathise with the experience of the Board of Management. But that's what was signed off on. A very slimly modified version of the Central Synagogue in London, of course, with the centrepiece being the bimah in the middle. And if you go to the next slide, and there we have the opening. That is the opening of the Great Synagogue. That's a contemporary engraving which was reproduced in the newspapers. Quite rare, in fact. It's difficult to find extra copies of these. But we have one in the synagogue collection. And unfortunately, it sort of cuts off a little early. But here you can see the building as completed. Instead of that rather expansive bimmer, you've got a rather smaller affair here, not built out of marble, but out of wood. The top has a set of arches, Gothic or Moorish arches, and then it's sitting on some sort of platform. And then at the front you can see a straight flight of steps. The pulpit had not yet been added to the building, and then the windows behind the ark rising to that arch, which, as we saw, is very, very similar to the arch at the central synagogue. So that's how the synagogue was built and how it functioned for almost the first 30 years. Now, in 1885, there was a proposal to remove the bimmer from the middle and to move it to the front. And that was defeated. That proposal was defeated because it said the members were in opposition to that proposal. We don't know any more information on either why it was proposed or why it was opposed, but we know there was an initial attempt only 7 years after the synagogue was built to change this arrangement. If we just move to the next slide. Oh, and the one after that? That's the pulpit when it was imposed. So I have been able to, this is my reconstruction from an aerial view, as it were, of what it originally looked like. We have the nice horseshoe, and then this rather small bimmer here in the middle, much less than Rowe had planned, just, I think, 100 inches across and 125 inches back, with another 50 inches of staircase, a straight staircase at the back. And then here at the arc end, you have two narrow steps, a broad step, two narrow steps, a broad step, and another narrow step, and then the landing where the ark is actually placed, and the pulpit was placed over one of those upper, more broad steps. So that's what it looked like, and that's what was extant from 1878 onwards, despite the attempt in 1885 to fiddle with it. But that didn't last forever, because there was a second attempt in 1906-07, which was successful, which did lead to the movement of the bimmer from the middle to the front, to the configuration that we can see today. So what changed? What changed between 1885 and 1906? Well, I think the most important change was the arrival of Francis Lyon Cohen, who may be the next slide if we're lucky. The arrival of Cohen as the chief minister in 1905, in my view, is the decisive change in the story of the interior of the Great Synagogue. The chief minister from 1878 had been the Reverend A.B. Davis, who had been the minister of York Street since 1862. And he was a reverend. He was very capable of leading the service. He gave quite stirring sermons, but he was not rabbinically qualified. By 1905, when it was decided he needed to step down, they really wanted to have a rabbi in Sydney who could convene a Bet Din, instead of using the Melbourne Bet Din, have a Bet Din here in Sydney, and could perform all rabbinic functions, including conversions, which was then, as now, a hot issue in the community. So the Reverend Francis Lyon Cohen, as he then was the minister of the Borough Synagogue in South London, south of the river, and he was encouraged by Herman Adler, the chief rabbi, to take the job. He spent a year studying. He was granted his smicha, became Rabbi Francis Lyon Cohen, and he arrived in Sydney in 1905. Now, Cohen is a very, very significant figure. My predecessor, Rabbi Apple, wrote his MPhil on Rabbi Cohen. He's not significant because he was the world's greatest rabbinic scholar, or because he had a very, very wide impact beyond his own community. He's very significant because he's a type. He's a very, very important representative type of the Anglo-Jewish ministry at the turn of the 20th century. He was born actually in Aldershot, near the British Army barracks, and that had two big influences on his life. One, he was very, very patriotic. He was one of the first Jewish chaplains to the forces, both first in England and then in Australia. Quite astonishingly patriotic, and was one of the loudest voices calling for troops to go off to war during the First World War, and for Jewish men to sign up and enlist in the British Army and Anzac in the First World War. So terribly patriotic, also very, very musical. He was very inspired by the military music of the nearby barracks, and he became an authority on Jewish music. And the Blue Book, The Voice of Prayer and Praise, which is the standard Anglo-Jewish musical manual, was edited jointly by Cohen and by a fellow called D.M. Davis, who was the choir master at the New West End Synagogue. He was educated at Jews College, the standard Anglo-Jewish ministerial training academy, but he was one of those who emerged from that training not quite halfway between orthodoxy and reform, but certainly orthodox with very, very strong sympathies and leanings towards some sort of reform-style alterations. I'll give you a few examples. He thoroughly approved of the mixed choir. There'd always been a mixed choir at the Great Synagogue since 1875, but he was particularly enthusiastic and wrote arrangements for the mixed choir. He tried to introduce the mixed choir when he was the rabbi or the minister in Borough Synagogue back in the 1880s. He changed the text of Kol Nidre. He argued that the text of Kol Nidre led to accusations by non-Jews that Jews were not trustworthy, that they could not be relied upon to keep their word. And so he asked the chief rabbi in London if he could change the text from the Ashkenazi to the Sephardi text, which he felt was less problematic in that regard. And he made that change. He wanted to introduce the organ into the synagogue. That was rejected by the chief rabbi in London. He moved around the prayer for Jew and the prayer for rain. In the northern hemisphere, the prayer for Jew is said at Pesach, and the prayer for rain is said at Sukkot, because that corresponds to the seasons in the northern hemisphere, in the land of Israel and the northern hemisphere. Well, Cohen said, look, we're in the southern hemisphere. The seasons are the other way around, so he moved Tal, prayer for Jew, to Sukkot, and he moved Geshem, the prayer for rain, to Pesach. The fact that this had been discussed in the medieval responder literature was not of much concern to Cohen. It made sense to him, and so he flipped them over. It took Rabbi Porish to put them back where they'd been before Rabbi Cohen arrived. So he had all these sorts of mildly reforming tendencies. And one of those tendencies was, I believe, to do with the orientation of the synagogue. Let's compare the synagogue as it was arranged, and therefore the experience of worship in the synagogue before Cohen and after Cohen. You noticed before the box in the original plan at the back of the bimah which the choir was to sit in. Now that box was never built, and I think the reason for that partly was that it was a mixed choir, as I mentioned, and so the choir was put in its own little section at the front of the ladies' gallery. So at the back of the synagogue, high up, that's where the choir would stand. The chazan would lead the service from the middle of the synagogue, and the pulpit, certainly from the 1890s, was placed at the arc end of the synagogue. The ministers themselves sat on the bimah in the midst of the congregation. So the experience of attending the Great Synagogue from the 1870s until 1906-7, when the movement was proposed and agreed and made, was that the ritual of the synagogue was, as it were, placed throughout the length of the interior. If you sat somewhere in the middle of the shul, you were, as it were, surrounded by the ritual taking place in the shul. The choir would be singing from over there, the chazan would be here. When the time came, the rabbi would preach from there, the ark would be opened from that point in the synagogue. It was placed throughout the entire length of the synagogue. Now that was a traditional Jewish way of organizing, placing participants and attenders at synagogue services, but it was not the way things were done in the church. In the church, you have a rather different arrangement in which everything happens at the East End, certainly before Vatican II and other rearrangements to the interior of churches. But the classical late 19th century church arrangement was everything took place at the East End. The altar was at the East End, the clergy inhabited the East End, there was even perhaps a rood screen which separated the holier from the less holy places in the church, and the congregation sat and, as it were, viewed the ritual. The ritual was done by the priest, who had a special status because of his ordination, and this was observed by a pious and attentive congregation. Now, in the 19th century, Jews around the world, America, Europe, and even Australia and South Africa, the major concern of acculturated Jews was to become more like their host nation, host society. They wanted to be less Jewish and more English, French, German, Hungarian, what you will. As time went on, that changed, and people wanted to be more distinct and more different, but in the late 19th century, the main impetus was to be more English, French, German, Hungarian, American, what you will. And Cohen is one of those ministers who was one of the proponents of that ideology. That was something that he and his colleagues were trying to achieve. It's not just true of Cohen, but I say he's very important as a real representative of a generation or two of ministers of that type. So, of course, he wore a dog collar. I'm sure that people here remember rabbis and chazanim wearing dog collars as they went about their duties. He wore a dog collar every day. He wore the garb of an Anglican priest as he went about his duties as the rabbi of the congregation. He wore, of course, vestments, robes, in the synagogue itself. Before he was rabbi, he was reverend, a term that's still used somewhat in the community. These are all signs of an approach of acculturation where he was a clergyman tending to the Jewish community as other clergymen were attending to the non-Jewish community. And it seems to me that this move to the front of the bimah and the entire liturgical life of the synagogue is a function of that move towards religious acculturation. It creates a much more church-like synagogue experience. Everything takes place on the bimah. All the ministers sit on the bimah. The chazan leads the service from the bimah. The pulpit was placed at the front of the bimah where we see it today. And the choir, not in 1906-07 when the bimah was moved, but in 1911, when the choir gallery was built, then the choir was also moved to that end of the building. So by 1911, you have a remarkably acculturated synagogue interior, where everything takes place from the ark end, and the synagogue membership, the congregants, sit and observe. Maybe they join in, maybe they sing, but ultimately they are sitting and watching, or standing and watching what is taking part at the front. That, I think, was the main impetus of the change. Now, that's not to say there weren't other influences as well. And of course, we discussed at the beginning the financial situation the synagogue was in. They were quoted £10,000 to £13,000 for the building, and it cost £23,000 to build. So the synagogue was always in a fair degree of financial trouble. And how do you make the money back that you've expended building the synagogue? You sell seats. And therefore, the 64 seats which were added into the center block, if we go back a couple of slides. Keep going. There we are. Here you see the center block of seats which were added in the space vacated by the old bimah. Those 64 seats could all be sold and could all be used to raise revenue year after year for the synagogue and its expenses. We shouldn't think that these seats needed to be added in order to accommodate worshippers, because on a regular Shabbat, or even, let's say, Pesach or Shavuot, the synagogue was not full. And on the high holy days, the synagogue would hire extra accommodation, the Maccabean Hall principally, in order to arrange overflow services. So on a regular Shabbat, there was plenty of seats, and on the high holidays, there were places elsewhere where people could attend services. These seats, although I'm sure it was a big incentive for the synagogue, the ability to build these seats, they were not built, as it were, for sitting in. They were built for selling. We know that even though they were sold eventually, it took a long time. There were spare seats in the men's section all the way through to the start of the First World War. So 10 years after these seats were built, they were still not all sold. But eventually, of course, they were sold. And then over the years, more seats were added in different places, and they were sold as well, because that was necessary for the income of the synagogue. So there was definitely a financial impetus and a sweetener, as it were, for the move. But it seems to me that in the context of the ideology of the day, the main impetus was this desire to create an acculturated and much more, as it were, Anglican form of service. Let's just go forward a few slides, and I will show you a contemporary example of the same arrangement. That is the Hampstead Synagogue in London. So the new West End was built in 1879. Princess Road in Liverpool was built in 1878, and the Bimmer then and now were in the middle. By the 1890s, that had changed, and this is Hampstead Synagogue, built in 1892, and there you are, hey presto, the Bimmer at the front of the synagogue. Now, because it was designed with that in mind, as opposed to being a later amendment or addition to the original design, it's much better designed, to be frank. It's much more spacious up there, there's much more room. Anyone who's been on the Bimmer and the Great Synagogue knows it's rather a cramped space, and the number of people almost doing somersaults as they try and dance around the shulchan, well, it's amusing if you're not taking part. But here we have the Hampstead Bimmer, which is designed by another Joseph, Delissa Joseph, the nephew of the architect of the Central Synagogue, and there is the Bimmer placed beautifully at the front where it's designed to be. That is an 1890 synagogue. The Great Synagogue in Sydney is an 1870 synagogue, follows an 1870s pattern. It's changed in 1906-7. And so you have a beautiful, as it were, little case study in a shift that's taken place. In the 1870s, New West End, Princess Road, Central Synagogue in London, they are still content to have the traditional arrangement. By the 1880s, 1890s, they're beginning to really feel it's time for a change, and the first synagogues in the Orthodox tradition crop up with this new arrangement. And by the first decade of the 20th century, with a sympathetic rabbi at the helm, now they actually make the change. And in fact, many, if not most, synagogues built, certainly in England and also in other parts of the world, from the 1910s onwards, were built with this arrangement of the Bimmer at the front. Wilbraham Road Synagogue in South Manchester, the Bimmer's at the front. The original arrangement of Golders Green Synagogue and of Hendon Synagogue in northwest London, also at the front. And many synagogues also in North America and in different parts of the world, whether in a non-Orthodox tradition like the Great Synagogue in Budapest, or a modified Orthodox tradition like the Great Synagogue in La Victoire in Paris, or a Anglo-Jewish synagogue like Hampstead. They all have this arrangement of the Bimmer at the front. Now, some, of course, have been moved back in recent years. Singers Hill Synagogue in Birmingham, built in 1855 with the Bimmer in the middle, moved to the front in the 1930s, moved back in the 1980s. Now, that, as it were, is the ideological story of the move of the Bimmer. But let's just go a little step back into the architecture and into the nuts and bolts of it all. Do we have anything left of the original Bimmer? Was it simply broken up and thrown out when the new Bimmer was put up, or is there some remnant, is there some artifact left of the original Bimmer of the Great Synagogue? And I think the answer to that is yes. So let's just go back a few slides. One more. This is the screen at the front of the centre block of seats in the Great Synagogue. If you go, as I'm sure you've all been, as you walk around the horseshoe of seats around the outside of the interior. Sorry?
I'm sorry. Sorry, Rabbi.
Oh.
Okay.
If you walk around the blocks of seats that form the horseshoe, there's a screen at the front of each one. And at the front of the screen, as decoration, there's a very simple Gothic arch. That is to say, an arch which just goes up to a simple point at the top. If you look at the front of the centre block, it doesn't have a Gothic arch. If you are eagle-eyed, you will see it's not Gothic quite, it's Moorish. It's Moorish because it doesn't go straight up at all. It goes down and then it bends slightly into the middle. It has a slight sort of inward bent. That is called a Moorish arch, and it's different to every other arch in the synagogue. And if you look at this piece of carving, wooden carving at the top, now sure enough there is carving at the top of every part screens in front of the seats. But it's different to this. It's much more simple. But let's go forward one. Slide. That is the carving on the shulchan. That is the carving on the reading desk, which sits on the bimah in the Great Synagogue and was moved from the original bimah when it was repositioned in 1906. And it's the same pattern. The same pattern occurs at the front of the center block as appears on the shulchan which is still on the bimah. And let's just go back a few more, and I'll show you something else. One more, a couple more. One more. Keep going. Stop. No, one more. There we are. If you look very carefully here, they're not Gothic arches either. They are Moorish arches. So what do we see? We see that the original bimah had a railing made not of Gothic arches but of Moorish arches, which makes a lot of sense because you want the bimah to be slightly more elaborate, slightly more special and differentiated from the run of seats in general, the run of the decoration in general. It has to have a bit more vavavoom. Now, those railings have gone forever because the railings around the current bimah are made of brass. But it stands to reason, we can posit fairly confidently, that if the railing around the top had these Moorish arches, and we see a Moorish arch in that screen at the front of the center block with a frieze of wooden engraving which matches the shulchan currently on the bimah, I believe that the screen at the front is actually part of the base of the original bimah. And when they had to put a screen at the front, rather than just constructing a new one, because they were strapped for cash, they salvaged a part of the original base. They decked it out with two posts on either end, which they'd also borrowed from the original bimah which they deconstructed. They used the four posts at each corner for the four posts at the corner of the new bimah, but there are also two posts without lamps at the top of the stairs up to the bimah, and they get placed on either side of this screen at the front of the centre block of seats. So we have, rather fascinatingly and very pleasingly from a sort of architectural and archaeological point of view, we have a remnant of the original bimah. So what did it look like? I think we can easily imagine that, if you go back one, that was the base which extended around all four sides. There was a straight row of stairs at the back, and then this same arch was arranged at the top as the railing, but of course without the panels behind. That's what the original bimah looked like. So if we go all the way to the very end, and slightly up, and slightly up, there we are. So there we have a different view of the interior, which gives you a very good idea of, allows you to imagine what it would have looked like. Of course, all of this bimah here was not there. The area of the centre block, the first three rows were not present, but from then onwards was the bimah itself with the stairs at the back. These four pillars with their lamps on top were at four corners, and the two pillars you can see, posts you can see at either side at the front of the centre block, were towards the back at the top of the stairs. So what we see from these changes in 1906-07 with the bimah and 1911 with the installation of the choir gallery is a three-part, if you will, a change which has three aspects, three different levels and three different types of content to what's going on. First of all, we have a simple piece of rearrangement, which we can trace back through finding, that's where that post went, that's where that bit of base went. We can see how they actually carried out the physical job of moving these bits of furniture around and repositioning them. We also have the financial incentive which we explored. We managed to put in another 64 seats and sell them in order to pay off the debts of the synagogue and to finance its operations. But thirdly, and I think most interestingly, we have this ideological change. What you see before you is an attempt to create an ideal 1906 Anglo-Jewish synagogue. They were restricted by the fact that it wasn't built this way, but that was the attempt. And the picture we saw of as built, that is the ideal synagogue of an Anglo-Jewish community in 1870, and they're trying to create the ideal synagogue in 1906-7. That is the move we see. Everything else, in my view, the financial side and the architectural side, these are both merely subsidiary aspects of what is essentially an ideological project, because I think always what's more important, either in architecture or finances, is a powerful ideology. And when you had a rabbi like Rabbi Francis Lyon Cohen, who really believed that the future and the success of Judaism in Sydney in the early 20th century was to make it acceptable to those who wish to have a highly acculturated, highly respectable, highly recognizable form of religion to the Jews and to their non-Jewish neighbors. This is the result, and that, I think, is the story of the moves of 1906 and 1911. And I'm very happy to take questions.